My workshop was a temple of logic and sanity, until the nails started spelling my name. My workshop has always been my sanctuary. You have to understand that. It's not just a place I go to work, it's the only place in the world that makes complete and total sense to me. The scent of pine and cedar sawdust is the air I was born to breathe. The heft of a well-balanced hammer in my palm feels more natural than shaking another person's hand. I'm a carpenter, see? A third-generation carpenter. My granddad built this workshop with his own 2 hands, and my dad filled it with the tools I now use. Every gouge in the workbench, every rust stain on the antique drill press, tells a story. It's a place of logic, of physics. You cut a board at a 45-degree angle, you join it with another, you get a perfect corner. Cause and effect. Simple. Reliable. It's the world outside the thick oak doors that's chaotic and unpredictable. In here, I'm the master of my own small universe, at least I was. It started subtly, as I suppose these things always do. Little things you'd brush off without a second thought. A chisel I was certain I'd left on the right side of the bench would turn up on the left. My tape measure, the one I always clipped to my belt, would be lying on the floor across the room. I chalked it up to being tired. At 28, I was pulling 16-hour days trying to get my business off the ground, taking on any project that came my way. Right then, I was working on a cradle for my older sister, Sarah. Her first baby was due in a few months, and I wanted to make something special, something that would last for generations, just like this workshop. So yeah, I was tired. My brain was probably misfiring, creating false memories of where I'd put things. It was the only logical explanation. Then came the sounds. The workshop is an old building, all timber and stone. It groans and creaks. It has its own language of pops and sighs as the temperature changes. I know those sounds better than my own heartbeat, but this was new. It was a faint, metallic clicking. A tink, tink sound, sharp and clear, like a single grain of rice being dropped onto a tin plate. It would happen when my back was turned, or when the sander was off and the room was filled with that heavy, sawdust-scented silence. I'd freeze, straining my ears, but it would be gone as quickly as it came. Mice? I set traps. The traps remained empty, the bait untouched, but the clicking continued. The first time I saw it, I nearly convinced myself it was a trick of the light. I was at the workbench, planing a piece of beautiful dark walnut for the cradle's rockers. I had a small open box of finishing nails sitting a few feet away. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a flicker of movement. I glanced over. One of the small, gleaming nails had rolled out of the box and was sitting by itself on the wood. I stared at it. Maybe the vibration from the planer had shaken it loose. That had to be it. I picked it up, tossed it back in the box, and thought nothing more of it. But a few days later, it happened again. This time, there were no vibrations. The workshop was silent. I was sketching a design on a scrap piece of plywood, completely absorbed. Then I heard it, not just the tink, but a faint scraping sound. My eyes shot up to the shelf above the bench where I keep my jars of screws and nails. A single 3-inch galvanized nail had slid from the lip of its container and was lying on the wooden shelf. I watched it, my heart starting to thud in my chest. It was perfectly still. I hadn't touched the shelf. The building wasn't shaking. There was no wind. It had simply moved. I tried to rationalize. Maybe the shelf wasn't perfectly level. Maybe the nail was balanced precariously. I spent the next 20 minutes with my spirit level, checking every surface in that workshop. Everything was plumb. Everything was level. My granddad didn't do shoddy work. The feeling of being watched started after that. It was a cold, prickly sensation on the back of my neck, the kind that makes you want to whip your head around. But every time I did, there was nothing. Just the familiar comforting clutter of my workspace. The saws hanging silently on the wall. The stacks of lumber waiting to be given purpose, the long shadows stretching from the dusty windows in the late afternoon sun. But the comfort was gone. My sanctuary was starting to feel violated. It felt like there was someone standing just behind me, in my blind spot, waiting. I started talking to myself, muttering under my breath as I worked. "Just tired, Leo," I'd say, the sound of my own voice a flimsy defense against the creeping silence. "You're just stressed out." I even started leaving the radio on, filling the space with meaningless chatter and pop music I couldn't stand. Anything to drown out the potential for another tink. The breaking point came last Tuesday. I was working late on the cradle, assembling the main body. The project was fighting me at every turn. Joints wouldn't line up, wood split unexpectedly. I was frustrated, on edge, and the feeling of being watched was heavier than ever. I slammed a hammer down on the bench in a fit of anger, sending a spray of loose nails skittering across the surface. "Fine," I yelled into the empty room. "Is this what you want?" The sound of my own unhinged voice shocked me. I was losing it. I had to prove to myself that I was losing it. With a trembling hand, I gathered a handful of 10-penny nails. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. I walked over to the clearest section of my workbench, a wide, smooth expanse of scarred maple. I was going to conduct an experiment. I was going to prove my sanity. I meticulously, deliberately, placed 10 nails in a perfectly straight line, each about an inch apart. They lay there, inert, stupid, just little pieces of metal. "There," I whispered, my voice hoarse. "Stay." I needed to get out. I backed away from the bench, my eyes locked on the line of nails. I walked out of the workshop, not even closing the door all the way, and went into the small office my dad had built in the corner. I made a cup of coffee, my hands shaking so badly I sloshed half of it on the floor. I sat there in the buzzing fluorescent light of the office, staring at the wall, for what must have been 10 minutes. Every creak from the workshop sent a jolt of ice through my veins. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I had to know. I took a deep breath, stood up, and walked back into the workshop. The air was cold, unnaturally so. I kept my eyes on the floor until I was standing right in front of the workbench. I slowly lifted my gaze. The line was gone. The 10 nails were no longer in a neat row. They had moved. They'd been rearranged into a deliberate, unmistakable shape on the dark wood. My blood ran cold. It was a letter, a capital, blocky letter, L. I stared, unable to breathe, unable to process what I was seeing. And as I watched, paralyzed by a fear so profound it felt like a physical weight, I heard it. Not from a shelf, not from a box, but right there on the bench in front of me. The quiet, deliberate sound of metal scraping against wood. One of the nails I had left scattered in my anger began to slide, moving on its own across the surface of the bench. It moved with a slow, horrifying purpose, inching its way toward the L. I watched, my breath caught in my throat, as it pivoted and settled into place next to it, forming a perfect, undeniable E. I couldn't move. My muscles were locked, my lungs frozen solid. The world had shrunk to the 4-foot square of my workbench, to the impossible reality of 2 metal nails spelling out the beginning of my name. It was a prank. It had to be. Some elaborate, cruel prank. I scanned the shadowy corners of the workshop, the rafters high above, searching for hidden wires, projectors, anything. My mind, the logical cause and effect mind of a carpenter, was screaming for an explanation. There was none. There was only the silence, the smell of sawdust, and the 2 nails that mocked every law of physics I had ever known. Then another one moved. A nail from the scattered pile on the far side of the bench twitched. It lifted ever so slightly, as if being nudged from below by an invisible finger, and then began its slow, deliberate journey. Scrap. The sound was deafening in the silence, a dry metallic whisper that grated on my very soul. It moved without hesitation, tracing a perfect curve across the maple. My eyes were wide, burning from my refusal to blink, terrified I might miss the moment the trick was revealed. It slid past the E, nudged against it, and came to a rest, completing the arc. Oh, Elio. A strangled gasp escaped my lips. It wasn't just a random event, a fluke of vibration. It was intelligent. It was personal. It knew my name. I stumbled backward, my hand flying to my mouth, my legs hitting the leg of the table saw with a thud that sent a jolt of pain up my spine. The pain was good. It was real. It proved I wasn't dreaming. This was happening. My sanity reasserted itself with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Magnets. It had to be magnets. Someone was under the bench with a powerful electromagnet, playing a sick game. I dropped to my hands and knees, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I scrambled under the workbench, my phone's flashlight cutting a panicked beam through the darkness. I ran my hands over the underside of the thick maple top. It was smooth, solid, 3 inches of pure, uninterrupted wood. There were no hidden compartments, no drilled holes, no embedded devices. I knocked on it, listening to the solid, dull thud of old-growth timber. Nothing. It was just a workbench. My grandfather's workbench. I scrambled back out, dizzy and breathless. I grabbed my magnetic stud finder from the wall and swept it frantically over the surface where the nails lay. Not a beep. Nothing. The nails themselves were just plain steel. They weren't special. The bench wasn't special, which meant the force moving them. It was something else. Something that didn't need wires or batteries. "Who's there?" I shouted, my voice cracking, sounding thin and pathetic in the vast space of the workshop. "Show yourself. This isn't funny." My only answer was the echo of my own voice and the low hum of the ancient refrigerator in my office. The nails remained perfectly still, spelling my name as if it were a casual signature. I felt a surge of desperate anger. This was my space, my sanctuary. I lunged forward and swept my arm across the bench, sending the nails clattering to the concrete floor. The sound was satisfyingly loud, a small act of rebellion against the impossible. I stood there panting, my fists clenched, staring at the now empty workbench. For a long moment, nothing happened. I started to let out a shaky breath of relief. Maybe it was over. Maybe I had scared it away. Maybe I had just experienced some kind of waking nightmare, a stress-induced hallucination. I closed my eyes, pressing the heels of my palms into them, trying to force the image of those moving nails out of my head. Tink. My eyes snapped open. A single nail, one I had missed, lay on the bench. As I watched, it flipped itself over, end over end, a neat little somersault. Then it began to slide. It moved to the center of the bench and stopped. Then another nail, one that had fallen to the floor near my feet, rattled. I jumped back as it rolled and then, impossibly, began to climb. It moved up the thick leg of the workbench, defying gravity like some grotesque metal insect, leaving a faint scratch in the old varnish. It reached the top and slid across the surface to join the first nail. Then another came from the floor, and another. They weren't spelling anything this time. They were assembling, gathering in the center of the bench like soldiers rallying to a silent banner. Within a minute, a pile of 24 nails lay in a heap. My anger was gone, replaced by a cold, primal fear that felt like swallowing ice water. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't a hallucination. This was something real, and it was displaying a power that I couldn't comprehend. I backed away slowly, my hands held up as if to ward off a physical attack. "What do you want?" I whispered, the question barely audible. "What are you trying to tell me?" As if in direct response to my question, the pile of nails began to stir. They separated, moving outward from the center with a fluid, unnatural grace. They moved with a new speed, a horrifying confidence. They weren't spelling anymore, they were drawing. Lines formed, angles connected. My carpenter's eye recognized the shapes instantly. A long, flat base, two high, curved ends, spindles connecting them. My blood turned to ice in my veins. It was the cradle. On the surface of my grandfather's workbench, the nails were arranging themselves into a perfect, two-scale outline of the cradle I was building for my sister's baby. Every detail was there, from the gentle curve of the rockers to the spacing of the slats. It was my design, my work, rendered in cold, dead steel by an unseen hand. I stared at the finished picture, a macabre blueprint laid out before me. It was a message, and I understood it loud and clear. It knew what I was working on. It had been watching me. Then the final, terrible act began. One last nail, lying by itself near the edge of the bench, started to move. It slid slowly, inexorably, toward the cradle outline. It crossed the boundary of the base and moved into the center of the shape, right where the baby would sleep. It stopped there for a second, a single steel occupant in a cold steel bed. My mind screamed. And then it did one last thing. With a final, sharp click that echoed like a gunshot in the silent workshop, the nail flipped vertically, its sharp point aiming straight down, as if it were falling right through the bottom of the cradle I had built to keep my niece or nephew safe. My legs gave out. I didn't fall so much as collapse, my back sliding down the rough-hewn wall until I was sitting on the cold, dusty concrete. All the air had been punched out of my lungs. The image on the workbench was burned into my retinas. The cradle, my beautiful, handcrafted cradle, with a single nail piercing its heart. It wasn't a warning. It felt like a verdict, a prophecy written in metal. The sound of that final click still echoed in my ears, a punctuation mark on a sentence of pure dread. For a long time I just sat there, staring. The nail drawing remained, a static, terrifying piece of art. The initial shock began to recede, replaced by a wave of nauseating fear, a deep, gut-wrenching certainty that my family was in danger. Sarah, her baby. This wasn't about me anymore. It wasn't some shop ghost playing tricks with tools. This force, whatever it was, had focused its attention on the most vulnerable, most precious thing in my world. A new energy, born of desperation, surged through me. I scrambled to my feet, my mind racing. I had to do something. I couldn't just sit here and let this This thing terrorized me. My first instinct was to destroy the cradle, to smash it to pieces, burn it, erase it from existence as if that could somehow undo the curse that had been laid upon it. I grabbed a heavy mallet, my knuckles white, and stalked toward the half-finished piece of furniture. It sat on its stand in the center of the room, looking innocent and beautiful in the dim light, the walnut grain glowing. I raised the mallet high over my head, ready to bring it down with all my strength. But I stopped. My arm trembled, the weight of the mallet suddenly unbearable. What if that's what it wanted? What if destroying the cradle was part of the message? I lowered the mallet slowly, my heart thudding. No, I couldn't act rashly. I needed to understand. This thing was communicating, however horribly. It spelled my name. It drew a picture. It was using a language I could understand, the language of my craft. My eyes fell back to the workbench. The nails were still there, a silent testament to the horror I'd witnessed. With a trembling hand, I reached for my phone and took a picture. I needed proof. I needed evidence that I wasn't going insane. The image on the screen looked flat and mundane, a cheap imitation of the terrifying reality. But it was something. I had to get out of there. The workshop, my sanctuary, now felt like a tomb. I backed away, my eyes never leaving the nails, and fumbled for the light switch. I flipped it off, plunging the room into near darkness, lit only by the pale moonlight filtering through the grimy windows. I didn't want to see them move again. I slammed the heavy oak door behind me, the sound booming in the quiet night, and twisted the old iron key in the lock. For the first time in my life, I locked my workshop. I didn't go home. I couldn't. My small apartment would feel like a coffin. I drove. I just drove, with no destination in mind. The windows down, the cold night air stinging my face. I needed the world to feel real again. I needed streetlights and other cars and the low thrum of the city to drown out the memory of that scraping, clicking sound. I ended up at a 24-hour diner, the fluorescent lights buzzing and the air thick with the smell of stale coffee and grease. I sat in a booth, shivering, and ordered coffee I never drank. I pulled out my phone and stared at the picture of the workbench. What did it mean? A nail falling through the cradle. Was it a threat? A warning of an accident? Was there a flaw in my design? My carpenter's mind kicked in, a familiar comfort. I ran through the plans in my head. The joinery was solid mortise and tenon. The base was a double-thick slab of walnut, strong enough for a grown man to stand on. The spindles were spaced according to every safety regulation. I had sanded every surface until it was as smooth as silk. There was no way a nail, or anything else, could just fall through it. It was structurally perfect. My work was good. I knew it was. So the message wasn't about the cradle itself. It was about what the cradle represented. The baby. My phone buzzed on the table, making me jump. It was Sarah. My heart leaped into my throat. "Leo, it's almost midnight. Are you okay?" "I'm fine," I lied, my voice a hoarse croak. "Just working late. Couldn't sleep." "Don't overdo it," she said, her voice warm and full of concern. "I was just calling to say thank you again for the cradle. I was looking at the pictures you sent. It's the most beautiful thing I've ever seen. I can't wait to put him in it." Him. They'd had the ultrasound. It was a boy. My nephew. The words hit me like a physical blow. A cold dread washed over me, so intense I felt like I was going to be sick. "Sarah," I started, my voice tight. "Listen, about the cradle." "What about it?" What could I say? "My workshop is haunted, and it's sending me death threats against your unborn child using nails. They'd have me committed. I think I found a small flaw in the design. In the base. I need to redo it. It's not safe." "Oh, Leo, don't be silly. It's perfect. You're such a perfectionist." "No, I'm serious, Sarah," I insisted, my voice rising with panic. "Do not use it. Promise me. I'm going to build you a new one." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "Okay, Leo, okay, calm down, if you say so. Is everything all right? You sound strange." "Everything's fine," I choked out. "I'll talk to you tomorrow." I hung up before she could ask any more questions and buried my face in my hands. What was I going to do? I couldn't tell her the truth, but I couldn't let her bring her son anywhere near that workshop, near that cradle. I drove back to the workshop in the grey light of dawn, a plan forming in my mind, as desperate as it was crazy. I didn't know what this thing was, but it lived in the workshop. It was tied to it somehow. My grandfather built the place. My dad worked here his whole life. Was it one of them? A spirit trying to warn me? No, that didn't feel right. The feeling I got in that room wasn't sadness or concern. It was cold. It was malevolent. I unlocked the door, my hand trembling so much it took 3 tries to get the key in the lock. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The air was still and heavy. I flipped on the lights. My eyes went immediately to the workbench. It was wiped clean. Every nail, the ones from the drawing, the ones I had swept to the floor, they were all gone. Not just gone, but the bench was clean, the floor beneath it swept. It was cleaner than I'd left it. For a wild second, I thought I really had imagined it all. Then my eyes fell on the cradle. It stood exactly where I had left it. I approached it cautiously, running my hand over the smooth, dark wood. It was just a cradle. A beautiful, empty cradle. My gaze drifted from the cradle to the far wall of the workshop, the old stone wall my granddad had built from rocks he cleared from this very land. And I saw it. It was my name again, spelled out in 3-inch galvanized nails, hammered deep into the ancient mortar between the stones. Leo. But it wasn't just my name this time. After the O, there was another shape. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was a number, 4 nails arranged in a precise blocky square with a tail. The number 4. My heart stopped. My blood ran cold. Sarah wasn't just having a baby. She was having a baby in 4 days. It was the date of her scheduled C-section. The entity in my workshop didn't just know my name and what I was building. It knew the day my nephew was scheduled to be born. And as I stared at that final chilling message, I heard a new sound. It wasn't the tink of a single nail. It was a rhythmic, repetitive scraping coming from the oldest, darkest corner of the workshop, from behind a stack of century-old oak beams I had never moved. A sound like something sharpening itself against the stone floor. Scrape, scrape, scrape. That sound, that methodical, rhythmic scraping snapped the last thread of my fear-induced paralysis. It was the sound of a predator sharpening its claws, a patient, confident sound that promised violence. The message on the wall wasn't just a countdown, it was a statement of intent. Whatever was in this workshop with me was preparing for something, and it was happening in 4 days. I didn't run this time. A strange calm, cold and clear, washed over me. This was my workshop, my family, my fight. I grabbed a heavy iron pry bar from the wall, its weight a small comfort in my hand, and moved toward the corner, toward the sound. The stack of old oak beams was massive, timber my granddad had salvaged from a collapsed barn decades ago. They were dark with age, dense as stone. The scraping was coming from behind them. "Get out," I said, my voice low and steady. It didn't waver. "This is my place. Get out." The scraping stopped. The silence that followed was somehow worse, heavier, filled with a terrible anticipation. I wedged the tip of the pry bar under the first beam and heaved. It barely budged. Adrenaline surged through me. I repositioned, put my entire body into it, and the beam scraped an inch across the concrete floor. Then another. Then another. Sweat poured down my face, my muscles screaming in protest, but I didn't stop. I was a man possessed, tearing down a wall to face the monster behind it. After 10 minutes of brutal, frantic work, I had moved enough of the beams to create a narrow gap. The corner behind them was dark, choked with cobwebs and the dust of ages. I aimed my phone's flashlight into the void. At first I saw nothing, just the rough stone foundation and the dirt floor. Then the beam of light caught something on the ground. A small, rotten leather pouch, the kind you'd use for nails, and a scattering of old, hand-forged, square-cut nails, rusted and pitted with age. And next to them, lying in the dust, was a single, ancient hand plane. The iron blade was extended far beyond what was practical, its edge gleaming unnaturally in the light. This had to be what was making the scraping sound. My heart pounded. This was where it was coming from. The source. I reached in, my hand trembling, and picked up the leather pouch. It was so old it was practically crumbling in my fingers. Inside, nestled amongst the dirt and rust, was a small folded piece of oilcloth. Carefully, I unfolded it. It was a property deed, dated 1888. The name on the deed wasn't my grandfather's. It was a name I'd never heard before. Silas Croft. I stared at the name, a chilling realization dawning on me. My granddad hadn't built this workshop on empty land. He had bought the land, yes, but the old stone foundation, the part of the workshop that had always felt different, older, he had built on top of it. This place had a history before my family, a history I knew nothing about. I spent the rest of the day in a feverish haze, not in the workshop, but at the town's historical society. An hour of digging through dusty archives gave me the story. Silas Croft was a carpenter, a master craftsman by all accounts, but a bitter, reclusive man. He never married, never had children. His workshop was his entire world, and according to the old records, he didn't sell his land. He lost it. He defaulted on his taxes, and the town seized his property. The records stated he simply vanished. But a local legend, a footnote in a town history book, told a different story. It said Silas Croft refused to leave his workshop. It said that on the day the sheriff came to evict him, he was gone, but he'd left a message hammered into his workbench in nails, a curse on any who would dare to work wood on his land, a curse against their children, and their children's children. It all clicked into place. This wasn't a ghost. It was a psychic echo. The rage and bitterness of a man who had lost everything, imprinted on the very stones and timber of the place he loved. He was a carpenter. His spirit, his anger, was speaking to me in the only language it knew, the language of the craft. It used nails to spell, to draw. It saw my cradle, a symbol of family and continuation on the land he felt was stolen from him, and its century-old rage focused on it. Silas Croft had no legacy, so he intended to destroy mine. I went back to the workshop that night. The dread was still there, but it was no longer shapeless. It had a name, Silas. I walked to the center of the room, to the half-finished cradle. The nails on the wall still spelled out Leo 4, a countdown to my nephew's birth. Silas, I said, my voice echoing in the quiet space. I hear you. I know what happened. The air grew cold. A familiar metallic tink came from the workbench. A single, rusted, square-cut nail one from Silas's pouch lay on the surface. It quivered, then began to move. It didn't spell. It just drew a straight, angry line in the wood, a line drawn in the sand. This is your workshop, I said, speaking to the empty room, to the nail, to the rage that filled the space. I understand that. You poured your life into this place. You were a master. I've seen the foundation. The stonework is perfect. I paused, letting the words hang in the air. But it's not yours anymore. My grandfather put his life into this place too. My father did. And now I am. We haven't disrespected your work. We've built upon it. We've honored it. The nail scraped violently across the bench, gouging the wood. The lights flickered. The feeling of being watched intensified, a pressure building in the room that made my ears pop. His anger was boiling over. You lost this place, I continued, my voice growing stronger. But your work remains. Your skill remains. I'm a carpenter, Silas, just like you. I'm not your enemy. I took a deep breath. And I will not let you harm my family. I walked over to the stack of lumber and selected a small, perfect piece of bird's-eye maple, a wood I knew was prized for its beauty. I brought it to the workbench and set it down next to Silas's angry nail. Then I took one of my own modern, gleaming finishing nails and placed it beside his. This cradle is for my sister's son, I said, my voice resonating with a conviction I didn't know I possessed. It's the first piece of furniture I've ever built that means more to me than the wood it's made from. It's a legacy, just like this workshop. Slowly, deliberately, I pushed the piece of maple toward the rusted nail. An offering. You have no legacy, Silas. Your name is forgotten, buried in a dusty book. Let me change that. The pressure in the room held, thick and suffocating. The rusted nail was perfectly still. I waited, my heart in my throat. This was it. Either he would lash out, or he would listen. Then the rusted nail moved. It slid, not with anger, but with a slow, measured grace, onto the piece of maple. It stopped in the center. Then, one by one, the nails spelling Leo 4 on the wall began to drop, clattering to the floor with a final echoing sound. The cold in the room dissipated, like a fever breaking. The oppressive weight lifted from my shoulders. The presence was still there, but it was quiet, subdued. I spent the next 3 days working like never before. I finished the cradle, and it was the finest thing I have ever made. But I did something else. I took that piece of bird's-eye maple, and using my most delicate tools, I carved a small, ornate plaque. On it, I chiseled 2 names and 2 dates. Silas Croft, Master Carpenter, circa 1888. Leo Hale, Carpenter, circa 2023. I affixed the plaque to the inside of the cradle, on the base, where it would be hidden from view, but always there. A shared legacy. a tribute, a peace treaty. My nephew was born right on schedule, healthy and screaming. Sarah sent me a picture of him a few days later, asleep in his cradle. He looked so small, so perfect. I went back to the workshop that evening. The air was different. The silence was no longer heavy. It was peaceful. My sanctuary was my own again. As I was closing up for the night, I glanced at the workbench. Lying in the very center was a single, rust-pitted, square-cut nail. It wasn't a threat. It wasn't a message. It was just a nail. A gift from one carpenter to another.